The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré sat at his wooden desk, contemplating a decision that would ripple across continents. The young leader of Burkina Faso had been wrestling with an idea for weeks, one that his advisors called audacious, his critics would label as publicity-seeking, but which his heart insisted was necessary. On his desk lay a piece of handmade paper, the kind his grandmother used to write letters on, thick and textured with fibers of cotton grown in Burkina Faso soil. He picked up his fountain pen, a gift from his late mentor, and began to write in his careful script. Sister Beyoncé, Africa calls to her daughters and sons scattered across the world like stars in the night sky. You shine brightest among them, carrying our rhythms in your voice, our strength in your spirit. I write to you not as a head of state to a celebrity, but as one child of the motherland to another. Come home, sister. Come and see Africa not through the lens of pity or poverty that the world has forced upon us, but through the eyes of love, of dignity, of the infinite possibilities that dance in our dust and sing in our winds. Your brother in struggle and hope. Ibrahim Traoré, he sealed the letter with red wax, pressing into it the emblem of Burkina Faso, the stallion that represents the dignity of the people. Little did he know that this simple act would soon dominate headlines from New York to Lagos, from Paris to Johannesburg. 3 days later, at Beyoncé's management office in Los Angeles, the letter arrived in a diplomatic pouch. Her assistant, Maria, had seen thousands of invitations over the years to perform at royal weddings, corporate events, and exclusive galas. But something about this hand-delivered envelope, bearing foreign stamps and an official seal, made her pause. Beyoncé was in her home studio when Maria brought the letter to her. The afternoon California sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows as she sat cross-legged on a meditation cushion, still wearing the headphones from her morning vocal practice. When Maria handed her the envelope, Beyoncé felt an inexplicable tremor in her chest. She opened it slowly, her manicured fingers careful not to tear the wax seal. As her eyes moved across Traoré's words, something deep inside her shifted, like a door opening in a room she'd forgotten existed. The letter wasn't asking her to perform. It wasn't offering money or exposure. It was calling her home to a place she'd never been but somehow recognized. "Clear my schedule," she said quietly, not looking up from the letter. "For how long?" Maria asked. Beyoncé's eyes were still fixed on the words, "Come home, sister." "I don't know yet." But clear it. News of the invitation leaked within days, though neither Beyoncé's team nor Traoré's office had said a word. In the age of social media, secrets were as fragile as morning dew. A photo of the letter appeared on a celebrity gossip blog, then spread like wildfire across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The reactions were as varied as they were passionate. On Twitter, #Beyoncé2Africa began trending worldwide. Some users celebrated the potential cultural exchange. Others questioned Traoré's motives, calling it a publicity stunt by a military leader seeking legitimacy. Western media outlets ran think pieces analyzing the geopolitical implications of a celebrity visit to West Africa. In Burkina Faso, the response was electric. Radio stations played Beyoncé's music between news updates about the possible visit. In markets across Ouagadougou, vendors discussed what it would mean if she actually came. Children who had never seen her videos but had heard her songs hummed "Crazy in Love" while helping their mothers sell vegetables. "She won't come," said Amadou, an elderly man sipping tea at a roadside cafe. "Why would someone so rich and famous come to a place like this?" "Because," replied Fatima, a young university student, "sometimes the heart calls louder than reason." International pressure began mounting almost immediately. French officials privately expressed concern about what they saw as Traoré's attempt to use soft power to strengthen his anti-colonial narrative. American diplomatic cables, later leaked, revealed discussions about the cultural security implications of the visit. One CIA briefing noted, the symbolic power of a figure like Beyoncé embracing the Pan-African narrative could significantly impact American influence in the region. Her global platform could amplify anti-Western sentiment across Africa and the diaspora. But the most intriguing response came from unexpected quarters. In Harlem, elderly civil rights activists who had marched with Martin Luther King Jr. called the invitation the completion of a circle that began with the slave ships. In Brazil's favelas, where Beyoncé's music played from speakers mounted, on street corners people spoke of it as the return of the Queen. Dr. Angela Davis, the renowned activist and scholar, was asked for comment during a lecture at UCLA. She paused, her eyes distant, before saying, "Every people needs their mythology, their moments of return and reconciliation. If this is real, if this is authentic, it could represent something profound, a healing across centuries." For 3 weeks, Beyoncé said nothing publicly. Her silence was deafening in a world accustomed to instant responses from celebrities. Paparazzi camped outside her Malibu home, hoping for a clue. Talk show hosts speculated nightly about her decision. Her own mother, Tina Knowles, was reportedly divided, supportive of the cultural connection, but worried about the political implications. During this time, Beyoncé spent hours researching Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traoré. She read about Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had inspired a generation before his assassination. She learned about the Faso Dan Fani fabric, the traditional weaving that Sankara had promoted as a symbol of African dignity. She studied the history of colonialism in West Africa, the ongoing struggles with neo-imperialism, and the complex dynamics of modern African politics. But it wasn't the politics that moved her. It was the stories of resilience, of communities that had maintained their languages, their music, their traditions, despite centuries of oppression. Stories that reminded her of her own grandmother's tales about a South where Black people had created beauty and strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. One evening, as she sat in her garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean, she called her grandmother's sister, Aunt Rose, who still lived in Louisiana. "Aunt Rose," she said, "I need to ask you something about our family." The elderly woman's voice was warm and steady. "What's on your heart, baby? Do you ever wonder about before Louisiana, before Mississippi, before America? Do you ever wonder where we came from?" There was a long pause. Then Aunt Rose spoke softly. "Every night, baby. Every single night. Your great-great-grandmother, she used to sing songs in a language none of us knew. Said they came to her in dreams. Said they were from before the water, before the ships. Maybe it's time somebody went looking for those songs." That night, Beyoncé made her decision. The announcement came not through a press release or social media post, but through something far more personal. Beyoncé posted a single image on Instagram, a photo of her holding Traoré's letter with a simple caption in multiple languages, English, French, and what her followers would later learn was Mooré, the local language of Burkina Faso. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind cannot understand. "I am coming home. Je rentre à la maison. Ma ba ya." The post received 10 million likes in the first hour. Comments poured in from around the world, from fellow celebrities, from African leaders, from ordinary fans whose lives had been touched by her music. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from Africa itself. President Macky Sall of Senegal tweeted, "Welcome home, daughter of Africa." Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie wrote, "Some journeys are not just physical. They are spiritual, psychological, historical, safe travels, sister." In Burkina Faso, the announcement triggered unprecedented celebrations. In Ouagadougou, spontaneous dancing broke out in the streets. Radio stations played continuous mixes of Beyoncé's music interspersed with traditional Burkinabe songs. The airport began preparing for what they knew would be the most significant arrival in the country's history. Ibrahim Traoré informed. Of her decision during a cabinet meeting, simply smiled and said, "Prepare the cowrie shells. A daughter of Africa is coming home." 3 days before her departure, Beyoncé's preparation was unlike anything her team had experienced. Instead of the usual designer wardrobe selections and security briefings, she spent hours with African fashion designers in Los Angeles, learning about traditional textiles and their meanings. She worked with a linguist to perfect her pronunciation of basic Mooré phrases. She studied the rhythms of West African music, practicing with drummers who had emigrated from Ghana and Mali. Her stylist, Ty Hunter, later recalled, "She wasn't preparing for a performance. She was preparing for a pilgrimage." The night before her departure, she held a private gathering at her home. The guest list was small but significant: her parents, her children, and a handful of friends who had known her since before the fame. As they sat around her living room, she spoke about her hopes and fears for the trip. "I've performed for presidents and queens," she said, her voice unusually vulnerable. "But I've never been so nervous. This isn't about entertainment. It's about, I don't even have words for what it's about." Her mother, Tina, reached over and took her hand. "Baby, you're about to step into something bigger than music, bigger than fame. You're about to step into history." Jay-Z, who had initially been skeptical of the trip's timing, had become one of its strongest supporters after seeing how profoundly the invitation had affected his wife. "You know what this is," he said. "This is bigger than the Renaissance tour. This is your real Renaissance." On the morning of her departure from Los Angeles, Beyoncé chose to wear a simple white dress with subtle gold threading, elegant but understated. Around her neck, she wore a pendant her grandmother had given her, a small piece of amber that had been in their family for generations. The flight to Ouagadougou was long, with stops in Paris and Bamako, Mali. During the journey, she spent hours looking out the window as the landscape below gradually transformed from European cities to the vast expanse of the Sahara, then finally to the green and gold patchwork of West African farmland. As the plane descended toward Ouagadougou, she could see crowds gathering at the airport below. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Miss Knowles Carter, I've been flying for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this." The moment the plane touched down, the sound was audible even inside the aircraft. Thousands of voices raised in songs, chants, and ululations. When the doors opened and Beyoncé appeared at the top of the steps, the crowd fell into a momentary hush of disbelief, then erupted into a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. She had changed. During the flight into a flowing ensemble made of authentic kente cloth, gifted to her by Ghanaian designers. Her hair was braided in a style reminiscent of traditional West African patterns. As she slowly descended the steps, tears were already streaming down her face. The receiving party was led by Ibrahim Traoré himself, dressed not in military uniform, but in traditional Burkinabe attire, a flowing boubou with intricate embroidery. Behind him stood traditional chiefs, government officials, artists, and what seemed like representatives of every segment of Burkinabe society. As Beyoncé reached the tarmac, an elderly woman stepped forward. This was Maman Pascaline, recognized as one of the keepers of Burkinabe cultural traditions. In her hands, she held a calabash filled with water from the White Volta River, the lifeline of their land. "My daughter," she said in Mooré, her words translated by those around, "drink from the water of your ancestors' land." Beyoncé accepted the calabash with both hands, her fingers trembling. As she brought it to her lips, the crowd held its collective breath. The water was warm, tasting of earth and minerals, of something ancient and elemental. As she drank, the crowd burst into song, a traditional welcome song that had been sung for centuries to greet important visitors and returning children. Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, his eyes bright with emotion. "Sister Beyoncé," he said, his voice carrying across the microphones but feeling intimate. "Welcome to Burkina Faso. Welcome home." She could barely speak. I never imagined," she began, then stopped, overwhelmed. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you for calling me home." The images from that moment, the global superstar drinking from a traditional calabash while thousands of people sang around her, would be broadcast around the world within minutes. But for those present, it was not a photo opportunity. It was a moment of spiritual reunion that transcended celebrity and politics. The first 3 days of Beyoncé's visit were carefully planned but felt spontaneous. Rather than staying in a luxury hotel, she was housed in the presidential residence, not in the formal state quarters, but in a traditional compound within the grounds, a cluster of simple buildings arranged around a central courtyard, much like the family compounds found throughout rural Burkina Faso. Each morning began with breakfast in the courtyard, millet porridge, fresh fruit, and strong coffee, served on traditional pottery. Beyoncé found herself charmed by the simplicity and authenticity of it all. "In America," she confided to Traoré over breakfast on her second day, "I'm surrounded by luxury, but I often feel empty. Here, with so much less, I feel full." Her days were filled with visits that revealed the true character of Burkina Faso. At a women's shea butter cooperative in the outskirts of Ouagadougou, she spent hours learning the traditional process of extracting oil from shea nuts. The women, initially shy in her presence, gradually warmed up as they saw her genuine interest and willingness to get her hands dirty. Mariama Ouedraogo, the cooperative's leader, later said, "At first, we thought she was just another rich American coming to take pictures with poor African women. But when she picked up the grinding stones and asked to learn properly, when she sat in the dirt with us and laughed at her own mistakes, we knew she was different." At a local school, Beyoncé was overwhelmed by the children's enthusiasm. They had prepared a welcome program featuring traditional songs and dances. But what moved her most was when they began singing Halo in French, their young voices transforming her global hit into something that sounded ancient and sacred. One little girl, perhaps 7 years old, approached her after the performance. "Madame Beyoncé," she said in careful French, "my grandmother says you sing like the griots of old times. She says music is how we remember who we are." That evening, Beyoncé told Traoré about the encounter. "That little girl understood something. I'm just beginning to grasp. Music isn't just entertainment here. It's memory, it's identity, it's resistance." Traoré nodded. "This is what they tried to take from us, not just our gold or our land, but our understanding of ourselves. When that child sings your song in her language, she's doing what her ancestors did, taking what comes from outside and making it ours, making it serve our story. On the 4th day, Traoré suggested they visit his home village, about 2 hours. Drive from Ouagadougou. "If you want to understand Africa," he said, "you must meet the elders. They are our libraries, our universities, our connection to the ancestors." The journey itself was revelatory for Beyoncé. As their convoy moved through the countryside, she watched life unfold outside her window. Children herding goats, women carrying water jars balanced on their heads, farmers working fields with tools that hadn't changed in centuries. It was a world away from the urban sophistication of Ouagadougou, yet somehow it felt more real to her than anything she'd experienced in years. The village, called cowrie, consisted of perhaps 50 traditional compounds clustered around a central area dominated by an enormous baobab tree. As their vehicles arrived, it seemed like the entire population had gathered to greet them. Drums announced their arrival, children scattered flowers in their path, and women ululated in the traditional welcome. Under the great baobab, 7 elders sat waiting, 4 men and 3 women, their ages ranging from perhaps 70 to what might have been over 90. They were dressed in their finest traditional clothing, the colors brilliant against their weathered skin. Their eyes held a depth that spoke of decades of witnessed history. The eldest among them was Mamadou Compaoré, a man so old that his exact age was unknown even to him. Through an interpreter, he addressed Beyoncé. "Child of the scattered seeds, you have returned to the root. We have been waiting for you, though we did not know your name or your face. The winds carried news of your voice across the water, and we knew one day the music would bring you home." The formal welcome ceremony lasted over an hour, involving prayers, libations to the ancestors, and the presentation of gifts that carried deep symbolic meaning. Beyoncé was given a staff carved from the wood of the baobab tree, a symbol of deep roots and enduring strength. She was wrapped in a cloth that had been woven by the grandmother of one of the elders, dyed with plants gathered from the local forests. But it was during the evening, as they sat around fires under the star-filled African sky, that the most profound connections were made. The elders began to tell stories. Stories that had been passed down orally for generations, stories that connected the people of this small village to empires that had risen and fallen centuries before Europeans ever set foot on African soil. They spoke of the great kingdoms of the Western Sudan, of trade routes that connected Timbuktu to Cairo, of universities in Africa that were centers of learning when Europe was still emerging from the Dark Ages. They told stories of resistance and resilience, of how their people had maintained their dignity through centuries of various forms of domination. One elder woman, Maman Salamata, looked directly at Beyoncé as she spoke. "They took our children in chains, scattered them like seeds to the 4 winds. But seeds don't forget their mother tree. And now, after so many seasons, the seeds are returning, grown strong in foreign soil, carrying new knowledge, but remembering the old rhythms." Beyoncé found herself weeping openly as she listened to these stories. They felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain, as if she was remembering rather than learning for the first time. "I understand now," she whispered to Traoré as the elders continued their tales. "This isn't about me coming to Africa. This is about Africa reclaiming all of her children. Wherever we are." The next morning in the village brought an experience that would fundamentally change Beyoncé's understanding of music itself. She was awakened before dawn by the sound of women singing as they prepared the morning meal. The melody was unlike anything she'd heard before. Complex harmonies that seemed to weave themselves around the basic rhythm like musical. She quietly left her accommodation and followed the sound to a cooking area where about 20 women of various ages were working together, their voices blending as naturally as breathing. When they noticed her presence, they didn't stop singing but gestured for her to join them. "I don't know the words," Beyoncé said apologetically. "The words don't matter," replied one of the younger women in French. "The heart knows the music." For the next 2 hours, Beyoncé participated in what she would later describe as the most profound musical education of her life. The women taught her traditional work songs, lullabies, ceremonial chants, and celebratory dances. Each song had a purpose, a function within the community that went far beyond entertainment. "In our tradition," explained Fatimata, a middle-aged woman who was clearly the leader of this informal choir, "music is not something you watch, it's something you do together. It binds the community, teaches the children, preserves our history, communicates with the spirits." As the morning progressed, more villagers joined in. Children added their voices, men brought traditional instruments, drums, xylophones, string instruments that Beyoncé had never seen before. What emerged was a spontaneous concert that included everyone present, with no distinction between performer and audience. At one point, the musicians began playing a rhythm that made Beyoncé gasp with recognition. "That beat," she said to Traoré. "I know that beat. It's in hip-hop, it's in R&B, it's in... How do I know it?" Traoré smiled. "Because it traveled with your ancestors. Music was one of the few things they couldn't take away on the ships. The rhythm survived, evolved, became blues, became jazz, became everything that followed." The realization hit her like a physical force. She was hearing the genetic code of the music that had made her famous, the ancient source from which all African-American musical traditions had sprung. That afternoon, she asked if she could learn some of these songs properly. The village women were delighted to teach her, but they insisted on teaching her the traditional way, through repetition, through participation, through absorption, rather than intellectual understanding. By evening, Beyoncé was able to join in several of the village songs with reasonable competence. But more importantly, she understood something about music that all her formal training had never taught her. That music was not a product to be consumed, but a language to be shared, not entertainment, but communion. As news of Beyoncé's activities in the village spread through social media and international news, the pressure began to mount from various directions. Her team in Los Angeles was fielding hundreds of interview requests, performance offers, and business propositions. African countries were extending their own invitations, hoping to capitalize on what was being called the Beyoncé effect. But the most significant pressure was coming from unexpected sources. Western governments, initially dismissive of the visit as celebrity tourism, were beginning to understand its deeper implications. Intelligence reports noted increased discussion of Pan-Africanism on social media, a surge in African cultural events in diaspora communities, and what one analyst called a dangerous romanticization of African identity. A leaked memo from the French Foreign Ministry expressed concern about the weaponization of soft power by African leaders seeking to undermine European influence. American diplomatic cables discussed the need to manage narrative around African-American engagement with the continent. But if external pressures were mounting, Beyoncé was becoming increasingly isolated from them. In the village, without constant internet access and surrounded by people who had never heard of her fame, she was experiencing something she hadn't felt in decades: anonymity, or at least the closest thing to it she could remember. "You know what's strange?" she told Traoré as they walked through the village on her 6th day in Burkina Faso. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm not performing. I'm not Beyoncé the superstar. I'm just me, and I'm trying to remember who that is." Traoré nodded, understanding. "Fame is a kind of mask, isn't it? It protects you but also separates you from your true self. Here the elders don't see your fame, they see your spirit." That evening, under the baobab tree, the elders held what they called a speaking circle, a traditional forum where important matters affecting the community were discussed. To Beyoncé's surprise, she was invited to participate not as an honored guest, but as a member of the community. The discussions centered around the changes that modernity was bringing to their village: cell phone towers, roads, the gradual migration of young people to cities. The elders spoke with wisdom and pragmatism about how to preserve their traditions while adapting to a changing world. When it was her turn to speak, Beyoncé found herself talking about something she'd never discussed publicly: the loneliness of fame. The difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships, the challenge of raising children in the spotlight. "In my world," she said, "we have everything but often feel empty. Here, you have less but seem so complete. I'm trying to understand how to take this wisdom back with me." Old Mamadou nodded slowly. "Child, completeness doesn't come from what you have. It comes from knowing who you are, where you come from, and what your purpose is. You came here seeking these answers. Now you must decide what to do with what you've found. By the time Beyoncé returned to Ouagadougou, Word of her village experience had spread throughout Burkina Faso and beyond. The capital city buzzed with an energy unlike anything locals could remember. Hotels were booked solid with visitors from across West Africa and members of the diaspora who had flown in hoping to catch a glimpse of her dot. It was during this electrically charged atmosphere that Traoré made his proposal. "Sister," he said as they sat in the presidential residence courtyard, "the people are asking for something I'm not sure I should ask of you. They want you to sing for them. Not a concert for profit, not a show for television, but a communion. A gathering of family." Beyoncé had been expecting this request, but it still made her heart race. "Ibrahim, I've performed for millions of people, but this feels different. These people aren't fans, they're family. What if I disappoint them?" "Then you disappoint them honestly," Traoré replied. "But I don't think that's possible. Your voice carried them to you across an ocean. It will not fail them now." The decision was made to hold the gathering in Ouagadougou's central square, Place des Cinéastes, named in honor of Burkina Faso's renowned film industry. The event would be free and open to all. No tickets, no VIP sections, no barriers between performer and people. News of the concert spread like wildfire. Within hours, the hashtag #BeyoncéWaga was trending globally. News crews from around the world began arriving in Burkina Faso, but perhaps more significantly, people began a pilgrimage of sorts to Ouagadougou. From Mali and Niger, from Ghana, and Ivory Coast, from Senegal and Guinea, people made the journey, some by bus, some by car, some walking incredible distances. But the most emotional arrivals were from the diaspora. African Americans used vacation time and savings to make the trip. Afro-Brazilians chartered flights from São Paulo. Caribbean people traveled from islands scattered across the Atlantic. Dr. Michael Johnson, a professor of African American studies from Howard University, was among those who made the journey. "This isn't about entertainment," he explained to a journalist. "This is about witnessing a moment of historical reconciliation. Whether you see it as symbolic or spiritual, this is unprecedented. The day of the concert, Place des Cinéastes, was transformed. Local artisans had worked through the night to create a stage that looked more like a traditional ceremony ground than a modern concert venue. The backdrop was a massive tapestry woven from Faso Dan Fani cloth, featuring symbols from Burkina Faso cultural tradition. Traditional musicians were positioned around the square, creating a 360-degree sonic environment. By afternoon, an estimated 100,000 people had gathered in and around the square. Rooftops were packed, nearby buildings had people hanging out windows, and large screens were set up in overflow areas. The crowd was unlike any Beyoncé had ever seen. Not the usual concert demographic, but families spanning generations, from elderly people brought in wheelchairs to babies carried on their mothers' backs. As evening approached and Beyoncé prepared backstage, her team noticed something different about her demeanor. The pre-show anxiety that usually characterized her major performances was replaced by something else, a stillness, a centeredness they'd never seen before. "I keep thinking about the village women," she told her musical director. "The way they sang while they worked, the way the music was just part of their breathing. I want to sing like that tonight, not as a performance, but as participation." When she walked onto the stage, the crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. But it wasn't the screaming enthusiasm of a typical pop concert. It was something deeper, a sound that combined joy, recognition, and what could only be described as relief. She began not with one of her hits, but with a traditional Burkina Faso song she'd learned in the village. Singing in Mooré, her pronunciation carefully practiced but still foreign, she offered a simple welcome to the gathered community. The crowd joined in, their voices lifting hers, correcting her gently, embracing her effort. Then, seamlessly, she transitioned into Black is King, but reimagined with traditional African instrumentation. The song became a conversation between her voice and the drums, between her movement and the swaying crowd, between the individual artist and the collective spirit. But the moment that would be remembered, analyzed, and celebrated for years to come occurred midway through the performance. Beyoncé paused, the music falling to a whisper, and began to speak. "My people," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "I came here as Beyoncé, but I stand before you as Giselle. I came as a performer, but I leave as a student. I came seeking to give, but you have given me everything." She paused, tears visible on her face even from the back of the crowd. "For too long, we have been taught that Africa is where we came from, not where we belong. But standing here, feeling your love, hearing your songs, I understand now. We never left. We were just temporarily separated from ourselves." The crowd erupted, but she raised her hand for silence. "I want to sing you a song I learned from the village elders, a song about seeds scattered by the wind that find their way back to the mother tree." What followed was perhaps the most moving performance of her career. Accompanied only by traditional instruments, she sang an ancient song about diaspora and return, about loss and recovery, about the unbreakable bonds between a people and their land. Her voice, trained in the most sophisticated studios in the world, found a new register, earthy, primal, ancestral. As she sang, something extraordinary happened in the audience. People began to join in, not with the words, which most didn't, but with harmonies that seemed to emerge spontaneously. It was as if the song was awakening genetic memories, activating cultural DNA that had been dormant for generations. By the time the song ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the square. But more than that, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a ceremony, a ritual of reconnection that would ripple out far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The morning after the concert, Beyoncé woke to find Ouagadougou still buzzing with energy. People remained in the streets, many having camped out all night, reluctant to let the magic of the previous evening dissipate. The performance had been live-streamed around the world, watched by an estimated 200 million people across various platforms. The global reaction was immediate and intense. #Beyoncé Africa trended worldwide. Think pieces were being published by the hour analyzing the cultural, political, and economic implications of what they had witnessed. African stock markets saw unusual activity as investors speculated about increased interest in the continent. Tourism boards across Africa began planning campaigns to capitalize on what was being called the homecoming effect. But Beyoncé was thinking about something much more concrete and lasting than cultural symbolism. She had spent the early morning hours in deep conversation with Ibrahim Traoré, walking through the gardens of the presidential residence as the sun rose over Ouagadougou. "Ibrahim," she said as they paused beside a fountain decorated with traditional mossy sculptures, "what I experienced here, the music, the community, the connection to something larger than myself, I can't just carry it as a memory. I need to leave something here, create something that will outlast this moment." Traoré studied her face, seeing the determination that her closest collaborators would recognize. "What are you thinking, sister?" "I want to build a school here, not just any school, a place where African children can learn that their culture, their languages, their traditional knowledge are as valuable as anything taught in European or American institutions. A place where music isn't just entertainment, but education, where art isn't separate from life but integral to it." The idea had been growing in her mind since her first day in the village. She had seen the hunger for education in the children's eyes, but she had also seen how the current educational system, inherited from colonial times, often devalued traditional knowledge in favor of European models. "I want to call it the Homecoming Academy," she continued. "A place where children from across Africa and the diaspora can come to learn not just reading and mathematics, but the deep wisdom of our ancestors. Music, storytelling, traditional medicine, sustainable agriculture, conflict resolution, all the knowledge systems that made African civilizations great. Traoré was quiet for a long moment, understanding the magnitude of what she was proposing. Do you understand what this means? This isn't just charity or even cultural exchange. This is a challenge to the entire structure of educational colonialism. There will be resistance, pressure, attempts to undermine it. Beyoncé's eyes blazed with the fire that her fans knew from her most powerful performances. Then let them resist. I'm ready for this fight. That afternoon, at a press conference held in the courtyard of the presidential residence, Beyoncé made the announcement that would dominate headlines for months to come. Dressed in Faso Dan Fani cloth, the bronze medallion from Traoré still. Around her neck, she faced a room full of international journalists and began to speak with a conviction that surprised even her closest advisors. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter that changed my life, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to announce. President Traoré called me home, and in coming home, I discovered something I didn't even know I was missing. I found my roots, my purpose, and my responsibility. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the assembled crowd. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, sensing that this was more than a typical celebrity statement. Today, I am announcing the establishment of the Homecoming Academy, right here in Burkina Faso. This will not be a vanity project or a publicity stunt. This will be a fully accredited educational institution dedicated to preserving, celebrating, and teaching African knowledge systems alongside modern academics. The reaction was immediate. Hands shot up around the room, reporters shouting questions in multiple languages. But Beyoncé continued, her voice rising above the commotion. For too long, African children have been taught that their languages are primitive. Their traditions are backward. Their ways of knowing are inferior. The Homecoming Academy will teach them that they are heirs to some of the greatest civilizations in human history. They will learn calculus and computer science, yes, but they will also learn the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the Dogon people, the advanced metallurgy of ancient Nok culture, the complex governance systems of the Kingdom of Kush. Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. The Republic of Burkina Faso is honored to partner with our sister Beyoncé in this historic undertaking. We are donating 500 acres of land outside Ouagadougou for the Academy, and we pledge our full support to ensure this institution becomes a beacon of African excellence. The questions came in a torrent after that. How much would this cost? When would construction begin? Who would run it? What about security concerns, political implications? The skepticism was palpable, but so was the excitement. The initial investment will be $100 million, Beyoncé announced, causing audible gasps. But this is just the beginning. I am establishing an endowment that will grow to $500 million over the next decade. The Academy will be free to all students accepted, regardless of their economic background. A reporter from CNN pushed forward. Miss Knowles-Carter, critics are already saying this is a publicity stunt, that you're being manipulated by President Traoré for political gain. How do you respond? Beyoncé's expression hardened slightly, the steel that had driven her to superstardom visible beneath her diplomatic demeanor. Let them say what they want. The only manipulation I see is the centuries-long manipulation that has convinced African children they should be ashamed of their heritage. If fighting that manipulation is political, then I'm political. A French journalist raised his hand. What about concerns that this academy could promote anti-Western sentiment, that it could be used to spread divisive ideologies? Traoré answered. Before Beyoncé could respond, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down much more serious opposition. The only divisive ideology here is the one that says African knowledge is worthless, while European knowledge is supreme. We are not anti-West, we are pro-Africa. There is a difference. Within hours of the press conference, the announcement of the Homecoming Academy was trending on every major social media platform. The reaction was as polarized as it was passionate. In Africa, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Presidents and prime ministers across the continent issued statements of support. African intellectuals and diaspora leaders hailed it as a watershed moment. The African Union announced it would provide institutional support for the project. Dr. Wole Soyinka, the Nobel Prize-winning Nigerian playwright, issued a statement. What Beyoncé and President Traoré are attempting is nothing less than the decolonization of African minds. This is perhaps the most important educational initiative on the continent since independence. But the response from Western capitals was decidedly cooler. French President Emmanuel Macron, in a carefully worded statement, expressed concern about educational initiatives that could undermine international cooperation and mutual understanding. American State Department officials, speaking anonymously, described the project as potentially destabilizing to regional educational standards. The business world was divided. Some investors saw the academy as a potential catalyst for increased investment in African education and infrastructure. Others worried about the political implications and the message it might send about Western educational models. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the African diaspora around the world. In Harlem, crowds gathered outside the studio museum to celebrate. In London's Brixton, Caribbean communities organized impromptu festivals. In Brazil's Salvador, the largely Afro-Brazilian population planned celebrations that lasted 3 days. Marcus Williams, a professor at Morehouse College who had attended the concert via live stream, captured the mood. This isn't just about one school in one country. This is about reclaiming our narrative, our history, our intellectual traditions. Every African child in America, Brazil, the Caribbean, we all just got a little bit more free. But not all reactions were celebratory. Within a week of the announcement, a coordinated campaign began to emerge aimed at undermining both the Academy project and Beyoncé's credibility. Think tanks in Washington and Paris began publishing papers questioning the wisdom of celebrity-driven educational initiatives in unstable regions. Academic journals ran articles by African scholars, many of whom had spent decades in Western universities, arguing that the Academy could set back African educational progress by decades. A particularly harsh critique appeared in The Economist, titled, "When Pop Stars Play Politics, the Dangerous Naivety of Celebrity Activism." The article argued that Beyoncé was being manipulated by African strongmen seeking to legitimize authoritarian rule through association with Western celebrities. More troubling were the personal attacks. Gossip websites began running stories about Beyoncé's radical transformation, suggesting she had fallen under the influence of extremist ideologies. Social media campaigns emerged questioning her patriotism, her business acumen, even her mental health. The pressure extended to her business interests. Several corporate sponsors of her various ventures expressed private concerns about her political activities. There were suggestions that her endorsement deals might be reviewed if she continued down this path. But if the opposition thought they could intimidate Beyoncé into backing down, they had seriously underestimated both her resolve and the depth of support she had tapped into. The attacks only strengthened the resolve of her supporters and brought new allies to her cause. Oprah Winfrey was among the first high-profile figures to defend the project. In a special episode of her show filmed at her California ranch, she interviewed Beyoncé via satellite from Ouagadougou. "Beyoncé," Oprah said, her voice carrying the weight of her own journey from poverty to global influence. "You're facing criticism that any black woman who dares to think beyond the boundaries set for her knows well. What keeps you going?" Beyoncé, still in Burkina Faso and looking more radiant than she had in years, smiled. Oprah, you know what keeps me going. A 7-year-old girl in Cumbre Village who told me she wants to be a griot like her great-grandmother, but also a scientist like Marie Curie. The Homecoming Academy will be the first place in the world where she can be both, where she doesn't have to choose between honoring her ancestors and reaching for the stars. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, the Homecoming Academy project moved forward with unprecedented speed. Architectural firms from across Africa submitted designs for the campus. The winning design from a Ghanaian firm led by architect Ajay Associates featured traditional building techniques and materials integrated with state-of-the-art educational technology. The campus would be built around a central courtyard featuring a massive baobab tree, with buildings radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Each building would house different aspects of the integrated curriculum. The sciences and traditional knowledge building would combine modern laboratories with workshops for traditional crafts and healing practices. The Arts and Communications Center would feature recording studios alongside spaces for traditional music and storytelling. Construction began just 2 months after the announcement, an impossibly fast timeline made possible by the enthusiasm of local workers and international expertise. The groundbreaking ceremony became a celebration that drew visitors from around the world. As Beyoncé and Traoré turned the first spade of earth together, the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Here was an African-American superstar and an African revolutionary leader literally breaking ground for a new model of education, one that honored the past while building the future. But perhaps more meaningful than the celebrity presence was the participation of the local community. Hundreds of Burkina workers, many of them descendants of the craftsmen who had built the great mosques of ancient Timbuktu, brought traditional building techniques that would be incorporated into the modern design. Mamadou Compaoré, the elderly village chief who had blessed Beyoncé's visit, was given the honor of planting a seedling from the sacred baobab tree of his village in the center of what would become the academy's main courtyard. "This tree will grow with the children who study here," he said, his aged hands steady as he patted soil around the young tree. "Its roots will remind them where they come from, and its branches will reach toward where they are going." As construction of the academy progressed, something unexpected began to happen around the world. The project had catalyzed a global movement of African and diaspora intellectuals, artists, and entrepreneurs who began organizing similar initiatives in their own communities. In Atlanta, a group led by Morehouse College announced plans for an African Knowledge Institute. In London, the British Museum faced unprecedented pressure to return African artifacts, with activists explicitly citing the Homecoming Academy as inspiration for their demands. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian communities began establishing cultural centers focused on preserving African traditions. Perhaps most significantly, other African countries began launching their own versions of the academy concept. Ghana announced the establishment of a Pan-African university focused on traditional governance systems. Nigeria proposed a center for African languages and literature. Kenya began planning an institute for traditional ecological knowledge. Dr. Amina Mama, a renowned feminist scholar at the University of Cape Town, observed, "What Beyoncé and Traoré have unleashed is bigger than any one institution. They've given permission for Africans everywhere to take pride in their intellectual traditions, to see themselves as knowledge producers rather than just knowledge consumers." The movement wasn't without its challenges. Funding remained a constant concern as traditional educational donors were reluctant to support initiatives they saw as too political. There were also debates within African communities about the balance between preserving traditional knowledge and embracing modernity. But the momentum was undeniable. A new generation of young Africans and African descendants around the world were beginning to see themselves differently, not as recipients of Western education and development, but as heirs to sophisticated knowledge systems that could contribute to solving global challenges. 18 months after the groundbreaking, the Homecoming Academy welcomed its first cohort of students. The selection process had been rigorous but revolutionary, focusing not just on academic achievement, but on cultural knowledge, community engagement, and creative potential. Among the 200 students in the inaugural class were children from across Africa and the diaspora. There was Amara, a 12-year-old from Mali, who spoke 4 languages and could recite the genealogies of the great Mali Empire. There was Marcus, a 14-year-old from Detroit, whose grandmother had taught him traditional African-American spirituals that preserved West African musical elements. There was Fatou, a brilliant mathematician from Senegal, who also happened to be an expert in traditional textile dyeing techniques. The opening ceremony was a global event, broadcast live to an estimated 500 million viewers worldwide. Beyoncé, now serving as the Academy's chancellor, gave the opening address alongside Traoré and a panel of distinguished African scholars. "Today," she said, looking out at the young faces gathered in the main courtyard, "we plant seeds of a different kind of education. You are not here to learn to be like Europeans or Americans. You are here to learn to be yourselves, fully, proudly, powerfully yourselves." The curriculum was unlike anything offered anywhere else in the world. Students studied calculus and quantum physics alongside traditional astronomical systems. They learned computer programming and biotechnology while also mastering traditional medicinal practices. They studied global literature while composing praise poems in their ancestral languages. The results were remarkable almost immediately. Students were producing research that bridged traditional and modern knowledge systems in ways that surprised even their teachers. A 13-year-old from Ghana published a paper on how traditional water management systems could inform modern sustainable development. A 15-year-old from Jamaica created a musical composition that mathematically mapped the migration patterns of African musical elements through the Caribbean. By the end of its second year, the Homecoming Academy had become far more than an educational institution. It had become a symbol of African Renaissance. Students from the Academy were being recruited by universities around the world, but many were choosing to return to their home countries to start their own initiatives. The economic impact was also significant. Tourism to Burkina Faso had increased by 400%. With visitors coming specifically to see the Academy and experience the cultural revival it had sparked. Local artisans found new markets for their traditional crafts. Young entrepreneurs were launching businesses that combined traditional practices with modern technology. But perhaps more importantly, the Academy had begun to change how African knowledge was perceived globally. Major universities in Europe and America began establishing exchange programs with the Academy. UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site for intangible cultural heritage. The World Bank began funding similar projects across Africa. Beyoncé, meanwhile, had found her life transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. She still performed and recorded music, but her work had taken on a new depth and purpose. Her latest album, recorded partially at the Academy with students and traditional musicians, had been hailed as her most ambitious and meaningful work yet. "I used to think success was about how many records you sold or how many awards you won," she reflected during an interview with Gayle King. "Now I measure success by how many children discover that their heritage is their strength, not their burden." As the Homecoming Academy approached its 5th anniversary, Beyoncé stood once again in the central courtyard, now shaded by the growing baobab tree that Mamadou Compaoré had planted. The elderly chief had passed away the previous year, but not before seeing the first graduates of the Academy return to his village as teachers and community organizers. The Academy now housed over 1,000 students from 54 African countries and diaspora communities worldwide. Its graduates were making their mark as scientists, artists, politicians, and entrepreneurs across the globe. More importantly, they were carrying with them a new understanding of what it meant to be African in the modern world. The little girl from Cowrie village who had inspired Beyoncé's initial commitment had grown into a young woman studying astrophysics at the Academy while also training to become a griot. She represented everything the institution stood for: the integration of ancestral wisdom and modern knowledge, the refusal to choose between tradition and progress. As Beyoncé watched students from across Africa and its diaspora collaborating on projects that addressed global challenges through uniquely African perspectives, she understood that the invitation from Ibrahim Traoré had led to something far greater than either of them had imagined. The Homecoming Academy had become more than a school. It was proof that African knowledge systems could not only survive in the modern world, but could lead it toward a more sustainable, equitable, and culturally rich future. That evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou and the call to prayer mixed with the sound of students practicing traditional songs, Beyoncé placed her hand on the bark of the growing baobab tree and whispered a prayer of gratitude. She had come to Africa as a visitor seeking connection. She was leaving as a daughter who had helped plant seeds for generations yet to come. And in the voices of the children singing in languages their great-grandparents had spoken, in the laboratories where traditional medicines were being studied, with modern techniques, in the recording studios where ancient rhythms were being fused with contemporary sounds, the future of Africa was taking root. The homecoming was complete, but the journey had only just begun. A decade after Beyoncé first stepped off that plane in Ouagadougou, the world had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The Homecoming Academy had spawned a network of similar institutions across Africa and the diaspora. A new generation of African leaders, educated in both traditional wisdom and cutting-edge technology, were transforming their communities and influencing global policy. Climate change solutions developed from traditional ecological knowledge were being implemented worldwide. Medical breakthroughs combining traditional healing practices with modern research were saving lives across the globe. International conflict resolution increasingly drew on traditional African governance systems. Beyoncé, now in her 50s, had become something she had never planned to be: a global elder stateswoman for cultural preservation and educational innovation. But she had never forgotten the moment when she first drank from that calabash of water from the White Volta River, or the night she sat under the stars listening to village elders tell stories that connected her to her deepest roots. The little seedling that had been planted in the Academy's courtyard was now a towering tree, its branches reaching toward the sky while its roots spread deep into African soil. In its shade, children from around the world continued to gather, learning that their heritage was not a limitation, but a launching pad for dreams as vast as the African sky. The homecoming that had begun with a simple handwritten invitation had become a movement that would echo through generations, proof that sometimes the most profound journeys are not about going somewhere new, but about remembering who you have always been.